brought to you by the Ayn Rand Centre UK. This is the closest thing there is to objectivist TV. It's where we apply the ideas of objectivism to real life events. And today I'm joined by Anders Ingemarson. Thank you for joining us, Anders. And we'll have some other people joining us a little later in the show. So we'll be able to have a panel discussion about what's going on with a particular news event that we're focusing on today, which is the death of Henry Kissinger, who died today at the age of 100. And he'd long been controversial, and we can get into some of those details perhaps. And he's well known for introducing the theory of realpolitik, not at least adopting it and making it his method of diplomacy in particular. So, Anders, what are your first thoughts on the life and times of Henry Kissinger?
Well, first let me say I admire him for living to be 100 years old and staying mentally sharp, it seems, till the very end. So kudos to him for that. And I hope I can emulate him in that regard. But that's pretty much everything that I admire about him. I think Henry Kissinger is the personification of everything that has been wrong with U.S. foreign policy in particular, but pretty much Western foreign policy since the Second World War. The focus on other countries meddling everywhere, left and right, Kissinger, Cambodia, the Middle East, South and Latin America, everywhere, and definitely not a proponent. He was for, putting the self-interest of Americans first. I don't know that even could have entered his mind, because a lot of those conflicts we should just not have gotten involved in. And it's and seeing then the tributes, and to the extent that they are earnest, and I suspect that many of them are, that's just another sign of how misplaced and bad our foreign policy is and has been for a long, long time.
Yeah, I'll certainly second your feelings, Anders. When I heard about it, first of all, it was like, well, the guy's still around. He's one of those names that you grew up with, and it's a shock to find out he's still around. And to be honest, spreading his poisonous approach to international politics and so-called diplomacy across the world, still to this day. Just found out that in July he actually went in China to meet our favorite communist dictator. So it's quite shocking that the kind of stuff he was doing in the early 20th century is actually dictated the policy up to these days. And we're seeing today Blinken trying to get Netanyahu to behave, to not to be too violent in a war of effectively which decide whether Israel has got the right to exist or not. That's just maddening.
I think that recent trip to China to see Xi Jinping, particularly at this stage, and particularly when relations between the US and China were thawing so much, and Biden was making such a point of resetting things following Trump as well, that it was depressing to see somebody being going over there at that point and using the kudos of their name to benefit what can only be benefiting the Chinese, giving them exactly that, the kudos of being able to shake his hand and show them as the diplomatic party in this. And it's certainly depressing. I did look him up in Margaret Thatcher's biography to see, because I felt sure they would have crossed paths at some point. Of course they did. And there was a reference in there to just the one, to be honest, which I was surprised, but there was a reference in there to when in 1982 she was preparing for the early stages of the discussion for the handover of Hong Kong, and she sought his advice on some of the preparations for that. And she describes him in there as that old China hand, Henry Kissinger. And that tells you, that gives you in just a short phrase the kind of person that he probably is, or probably was. The fact that he had knowledge, he had fingers in pies, he had contacts on different sides, but he knew how to play things and play people one against the other. I think to your point about his longevity, that was the best point about it. I read it within there that he had heart bypass surgery age 58, and it is definitely reassuring to know that, you know, a heart bypass surgery doesn't indicate that your time is up. You could still have the best part of half a decade still to go. So that is, definitely encouraging. What are the elements of his international dealings which most stand out for you, Anders?
It's probably Nixon's visit to China. You know, I mean, what we saw with Xi Jinping and Biden here, it's just a reprise of that thing. I'm old enough to have been around when that visit took place. I mean, I was young enough, so it didn't really register too much. But you know, even as a child, you know, you couldn't avoid it completely because it was a big deal, and that. That appeasement of Mao and that was seen as a step forward in the relations between the U.S. and China. I mean, it was just disgusting, basically abominable, and I think that's a really good, you know. I mean, just that particular one that tells you all that you need to know about Henry Kissinger and that kind of approach and how then, I mean, he's seen as a representative of realpolitik, you know, and I mean, what realpolitik is, it's simply pragmatism applied to foreign policy. You know, don't connect the dots, don't look at what is truly in Americans' interest, just go out there and meddle left and right. And I suspect that he had a lot of fun and you know, he got a kick from being this guy who was involved in every conflict around the world and had a say and advised people on his terrible ideas and such. So, you know, but yeah, no, I have nothing good to say about Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Anders. And thank you also to Jonathan Honig for the super chat of $4.99. We appreciate your support. Thank you very much. And good to see Matthew joining us here as well, also here in London. So thank you for joining us, Matthew.
Yeah, so sorry I'm a little bit late, guys. I had an issue leaving court, sorry.
No problem. We totally understand. We live in the same city. We know what it's like to get about.
Yes.
I do want to also thank Megan for her $2. She says, I don't understand old China hand. Translate. Okay, that was the reference I just made to Thatcher's comment on Kissinger. It means he's how would you best describe it? He's got the inside story, but he's also got how would you put it? It's such an English expression. It's difficult to pick out. It kind of means that he knows the right people, but not necessarily in the right way. You were kind of suspicious of what his motives are, who he's dealing with, for whom. But he's the one that you can't get round. He's the fixer, if you like, when it comes to that sort of thing. So it's certainly a slight. It's certainly it's a negative, a pejorative term. At the same time that she's using him for the same purpose, which is a bit of advice on China. And I think his advice to her in those Hong Kong negotiations was, don't worry, they play it the long game. They won't reveal their hand very easily. That's how, that you just go with it and don't expect them to show their face too early. So, you know, yeah.
Yeah, actually, Margaret Thatcher giving back Hong Kong is one of the few things I hold against her. Maybe wouldn't be surprised if Kissinger had something to do with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Matthew, what are your thoughts on Henry Kissinger, just to open?
Well, basically pragmatism writ large, essentially. I mean, he's said to have been instrumental in Nixon supporting communist China taking the seat at the UN rather than what is now called Taiwan, the sort of democratic capitalist China as it was at the time. He's, as I understand it, said to have been responsible for or partly responsible for the decision to start bombing Cambodia during the Vietnam War. And while this wouldn't have been his intention, I'm sure, that played massively into the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian communists coming to power, who surely stand out as potentially the worst communist regime ever if you actually research some of what they got up to in Cambodia. So not a good legacy at all, I would say.
That's the event for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, right? And
Exactly.
which, as I understand it, he chose to give the money to charity and hand back the medal after it became evident that essentially the policy had crashed and burnt and failed. I think the elements of realpolitik that stick out for me are the fact that it's piecemeal and it's temporary and it's a quick win wherever you can get one from whichever side you can get, and all the boundaries shift and move all the time, so that the principles don't remain fixed for anyone. And you've already seen that in some of the recent dealings he had when talking about Russia and Ukraine, and talking about when Putin took over Crimea and also the Donbass region, and before long Kissinger was saying that Putin should keep both Crimea and the Donbass region, despite having said the opposite not so long before. So it's always that shifting sands sense of it. Anders, would you say you've seen that impact of his reflect on diplomacy around the world and how people go about it beyond the United States as well?
I would say so. I think it's prevalent all over the place. So, I mean, the only principle involved here is that there are no principles. If you see after Kissinger's time in office, if you like, I mean, the war in Bosnia was the next one, and then of course we have the debacle with Iraq and Afghanistan, and the U.S. policy, the whole U.S. policy in the Middle East. So it just keeps continuing.
Definitely. Marco, did you have any extra thoughts you wanted to add?
Well, no, I mean, his approach to politics, as I said earlier, we've seen it at the time, and we keep seeing people, politicians, nowadays politicians clearly have learned from him, assuming he's the go-to guy. He is the one they have to learn diplomacy from. But, you know, as Anders said, there's no principle behind. It's just literally playing one side against the other, telling something to one side and the opposite to the other in order to get some sort of compromise. And as Richard said, we've seen it on Ukraine. He says some weird thing. He's reported to have said some weird thing about his Jewish heritage. He says something like, "I would be anti-Semitic if an accident of birth didn't make me being born in Israel." It's like, you know, but everything is done from even it was particularly known for having cut out the State Department when he was in the Nixon administration by doing deals with Nixon in private. You know, we know that Nixon wasn't the most open of guys, and the two of them seem to have been very close at the time, and they were effectively crafting policy closed doors without including the rest of the State Department. And that's a sign of the kind of guy who you don't want to be on your side, but definitely not against you. It must have been a right slippery guy.
And one of the things that I read today when looking into this was that he also went to the 2008 Beijing Olympics to quite a big fanfare, taking his grandchildren with him and stuff. Again, giving the Chinese exactly the kind of PR boost that they were looking for at that particular time, of having such a recognized statesman in inverted commas, attending the opening ceremony and making it a more prestigious event for that. Matthew, do you see any other comparable figures in across that reach quite his stature? Because he seems to have literally been everywhere and involved in everything at all times, to a degree that's hard to fathom. I can't think of a comparable one, but I don't know whether one springs to mind for you. Or
I don't think so. No, I mean he was, he was sort of effectively the wrong person in the key place at key points in time, and I don't think there is a comparison really.
What do you put his success down to, if you can use that word in relation to his career?
Well, I guess pragmatism and, by extension, realpolitik just kind of came into vogue in the later part of the 20th century, and he just kind of fit the bill, I guess, didn't he?
Certainly, yeah. I can't think of a modern equivalent now. I can't imagine anyone. Whether part of the problem here is that they don't have the initial stature that he had when he was working within the administration that would allow them to last beyond the administration they work for right now. Whether that's the key distinction between our current crop of diplomats and the likes of Henry Kissinger, whether you're for or against him.
But I always think perhaps because of the particular, as Matthew said, he was the wrong guy all over the place at the particular point in history when, in the early mid 20th century, of course, we have the Cold War. So that would have been a fertile ground for this kind of secret diplomacy. And, he clearly, I think he if not invented, he certainly was the guy, the shuttle diplomacy. He would keep going to and fro from the two parties was dealing with incremental changes, incremental thing in order to get to his appeasement, his compromise stuff. But that period we Cold War, when you had USSR versus the US, so the two blocks standing against each other, would have caused a plethora of satellite states and satellite influences. The Russians were trying to interfere in Western business, and the West were trying to set up small governments in small states, trying to stop the Russian move. So there would have been a lot of instability and a lot of, as I said, fertile ground for his activities. So in a way, I don't think today you could have the equivalent, if anything else, because things are slightly more stable nowadays, probably.
One of the things I think is noticeable is that in lots of his dealings, he seems to have assumed the best or the best motives in the other side a lot of the time, particularly when dealing with the Soviet Union. He seems to have assumed that they'd moved on from the USSR days far sooner than many other people had recognised, and that therefore a détente and a thawing and some bones thrown to them was the right thing to do. Anders, would you say that that's typical of today as well? That there is an assumption that those who are the worst players on the international stage are given too much leniency, too much credit for having changed or not being as malevolent as everybody takes them to be?
Yeah, I think that is the case. I would call it more wishful thinking, actually, on behalf of many, and I mean, not seeing reality as it is. That would be my take on it. But yeah, I was thinking too about other figures that you mentioned that would be comparable. And yeah, it's hard to find someone. I mean, earlier on, in terms of longevity and impact on his country for a long period of time, obviously Winston Churchill comes to mind. But he was certainly a better man when it comes to foreign policy, even though his domestic policy was left a lot to could have been improved upon a lot, obviously. But other than that, it's hard to think of anybody who's been around for so long, and has had such a major impact on a country's foreign policy, or the world's for that matter.
I mean, certainly not in terms of diplomacy necessarily, but in terms of the name popping up as similarly as often, names like George Soros spring to mind, where whatever you're looking into, suddenly at some level you seem to find he's involved at some level, or has at least been pontificating on it. But it's in no way comparable. Absolutely, I think that's what sets him apart and makes him so unique.
Yeah. Now, you could obviously argue that the philosophical trend of pragmatism as applied to foreign policy would have been there even without Henry Kissinger. So we don't want to give him too much credit. I think there would have been somebody else filling that role, or a few others filling that role. I don't think we would have seen necessarily a better trajectory of foreign policy without Henry Kissinger. So
yeah, perhaps fairer to say he's the poster child, or the role model for, rather than the instigator of it, or the leader of it as such.
And it's not a coincidence that realpolitik actually comes from Germany, the country famous for exporting the worst philosophy ever. And talking of which, the Ferguson, what's his name? Niall Ferguson wrote, I think, a biography of Kissinger, didn't he? And he actually says that he was inspired by Kantian philosophy as interpreted by Princeton or Harvard. Yeah. So imagine what a great guy that would have turned out to be.
Matthew, what do you think his impact on dealings with the UK have been down the years? Is there anything that strikes your memory from UK politics and foreign relations?
Nothing especially stands out. I mean, it kind of would make sense, as was suggested earlier, if he'd had a hand in the decision to agree to pass Hong Kong back to China. I think that would certainly fit right in the mold. But in terms of anything explicit that's known, I can't think of anything.
Right. Okay.
It would be interesting to know, and I don't know at all, but if he played a role in the Falkland War, because I mean, Maggie Thatcher was pretty adamant about Britain's role there, and there was no way we would give up, or you guys would give up the Falklands. You could have seen him in there, of course, meddling too, and trying to reach a compromise of some kind.
I may be wrong about this, but my sense is that the US State Department were actually not very happy with Margaret Thatcher actually sending the troops in. They wanted to, as I understand it, and I'm happy to stand corrected on this, that they saw the military regimes in South America as kind of a bulwark against communists, and they didn't want to sort of piss them off, as it were.
And certainly when it comes to South America, I think he was involved in the Panama Canal process of leading that to be handed over to the US after they'd had ownership of it for a period of time, and in an attempt to improve negotiations across Latin America and relations between Latin American countries and the US. So and there's some big questions on that for one thing.
I didn't find anything that talked about his reaction about the Islamic Revolution in '79. Do any of you know whether he had any to say about it? I find it weird that I couldn't find any mention of him? I don't know whether.
Yeah, that's a good question, but I don't know either.
In the chat, we have another super chat from Megan Ribbons. Thank you very much, Megan, for your $5. And Megan points out that Kissinger was on the board of the 9 billion fraud Theranos, and asked, what is the epistemological lesson here? Yes, absolutely. Now, her name slips my mind, but that's the woman recently sent to prison, wasn't it, for a giant fraud case?
Elizabeth Holmes.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. What do you draw the? Do you think that was a slip up at the end, or a sign of epistemological missteps that were more deep seated within the person himself? What do you reckon to that, Anders?
Oh, I really don't know. I think he just liked being on boards, and Theranos, I think, as a board member there, I don't know how exposed they were to the details of the company, but it was, for a while there, it was, a real high flyer, and everybody probably wanted to be on their board. So I don't know if that in particular would mean anything in terms of his judgments.
Yeah, and who can say? But maybe being paid to be on a letterhead is a lucrative. In the same way that giving the Chinese kudos, you end up giving a board or a company that perhaps doesn't deserve it whatever the kudos of a long-standing recognized name. So Matthew, any last thoughts on Henry Kissinger?
No, I mean on the last topic, I mean I'm aware he was on a number of boards. I don't think there's enough there to say anything specific about that particular company from what I'm aware of. To sort of draw any epistemological conclusions, certainly.
Again, I don't know about the guy personally, but the fact that when he dies, Xi Jinping calls him a friend of China, and with all pomp and circumstance, and even Putin's got something nice to say about him. I can't help but think, well, perhaps this guy's life wasn't as good as it could have turned out to be. You can only infer that what he did wasn't the objectivist thing to do. That's for sure.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised by the outpouring of support from Israel. Is he really seen as a pivotal figure there in securing peace and such, or are they just paying lip service to the man?
Again, I wonder whether that's Netanyahu just demonstrating his own pragmatism at the moment, especially with some of the hostage exchanges and the deals that he's negotiating there, and whether therefore that he's using praise for Kissinger to give some backup to what he's doing for in terms of not standing on the principles that us here would like him to be firm on.
Yeah, that sounds plausible when it comes to Bibi, but there were quite a few others too who had very nice words to say about Henry Kissinger. But
I think one of the little anecdotes I did read, which seemed telling, although I wasn't able to explore it deeper, which was that after the 9/11 attacks, he was initially going to write a report on what to do subsequently, and eventually he ended up having to pull out of that because he didn't want to reveal his full contact list and his supposed conflicts of interest, and would prefer not to take part rather than to expose that. So that suggests that you never know with a figure like that who he's really speaking to, under what terms, at what point in time, and therefore how honest your dealings can be.
There's a chat from Razi. Did you pay any money, Daniel? He said that he was no friend of Israel, and he has, by neither are Israel leaders. So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Good points both. Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, guys, both of you, for joining us today on the reality show. We'll be back here on this channel tomorrow for the Daily Objective and another reality show, as we are every day of the week. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.